Competition performs, as we all know, an economic function. It produces goods and services at prices that give a reasonable return to capital and cover the costs of production. And it forces lower and lower prices as more and more competitors emerge. It preserves, equally important, is the social function of competition. Open competition provides a route up the ladder, a route for social mobility by preventing powerful incumbents from squelching challengers and killing them off in their incipiency. In practice, this means the prosecution of criminal cartels, which is best done by government, the prevention of the use of exclusionary tactics such as predatory pricing, a refusal to allow mergers that may substantially lessen competition. Smith used the phrase perfect liberty in commercial relations, which he held was essential to the attainment of natural prices, and said that that's the level to which competition would drive them. And that, I think, is why those of us who are always a little nervous about government actions should assign a vigorous role to government in preserving competition. If we don't preserve markets. Instead, in Smith terms, we invite the clumsy hand of the regulator to replace the invisible hand of the market. Hayek, among others, saw this clearly. Once monopoly power is acquired, he wrote, the only alternative to a return to competition is the control of the monopolies by the state, a control which, if it is to be made effective, must become progressively more complete and more detailed. Capitalist organizers of monopoly are short-sighted in believing they will be allowed to perpetuate such a system. And then he added, personally, I should prefer to have to put up with some such inefficiency than have organized monopoly control my life. So I do think that we have to recognize that government, where it can, has to preserve competition. I've always felt that, from my point of view, the economic function was important, but in the end, I have great faith in a Schumpeterian gale of creative destruction to erode monopoly positions. But what I worry about is the social mobility question, because the basic acceptance of capitalism depends in part on the feeling that there is a great deal of social mobility. And one of the things that I think Margaret Thatcher brought to Britain was a kind of amelioration of the class warfare. I mean, an American coming over was always told the story that an American worker seeing his boss drive to work in a Rolls Royce said, someday I'll have one, whereas a British worker said, how can I scratch it? I think that to keep a mobile society, to keep capitalism as the dominant feature, we have to preserve competition. And I've always had the feeling that when Gordon Brown was Chancellor of the Exchequer and a proponent, you remember Gordon Brown, and a proponent of criminalizing cartel behavior, that while I thought I'd made a really powerful case for the economics of this, he was thinking of it in terms of social mobility. Now, forget he got a lot of other things wrong about social mobility, but he had this one, I think, quite right. The second role I think we have to accept for government, and I think Smith would accept, is that we have to regulate sectors of the economy where effective competition is impossible. Now, there are a few as such. They were called natural monopolies by economists. It turns out most of them were really created by quite unnatural acts. But there are still some. Transmission of electric power. The provision, that's causing you a problem, right? Because you're willing to string lines again all across the country, I know. Provision of distribution of gas, natural gas service. Although the way you dig up the streets in London, I think you could probably have 4 competing gas companies without any added grief. But there remain some, and I think that where competition can't be relied upon to produce prices that reflect the cost of serving the consumer, where they can't be relied upon to drive innovation, where entry is difficult enough to make it an ineffective threat to incumbents during a reasonable time frame in which we make policy, a system of direct governmental prescription of major aspects of regulated companies is absolutely necessary to mimic absent competition. Now, whether we like it or not, that's the name of the game where you have regulated monopoly. Yes, thanks to technology, the industry is capable of withstanding the howling gales of creative destruction, are fewer than ever, but they exist. Many of them created by government. And in those cases, we do have to regulate them. Yes, there are gray areas where it's difficult to tell whether you need this or not. And yes, regulation in effect creates a government of men, not laws, because the way your parliamentarians and my congressmen draft legislation, it's very broadly written, and it's up then to the regulator, who is not subject to democratic constraint in a direct way. It makes very nervous, and it's an undemocratic way. And yes, there's a danger that it becomes the tool of powerful incumbents who manipulate the regulatory process to their end. It's called regulatory capture. It's not corruption in the sense that, I'll pay you so much and you let me raise gas rates. It's corruption, it's intellectual corruption in the sense that the regulator begins to feel himself responsible for the well-being of the company he is regulating, and therefore takes decisions that are not really in the public interest. But yes, these are different, but policy making is hard. It's not easy. The main thing is to keep the goal clearly in mind, and the goal is rather simple. Competition where possible, regulation where necessary, where competition is not possible. I would suggest to you that this neo-orthodoxy, this reliance on markets to the outer limit, but relying on government where markets don't work, is essentially pure Adam Smith. And I think it's a superior policy to recoiling every time the word regulation is mentioned. And I'll give you some examples of that in a minute. So that's 2. 3. I think government has an obligation to see to it that the social costs of private production and consumption are internalized. That is, they are borne by those who create those costs. If you drive your car and you create pollution because, well, in your country, it's impossible to imagine petrol not being sufficiently taxed. But in my country, because petrol is insufficiently taxed, the driver is imposing a burden on society for which he's not paying, and he should. Now that means taxation, which is another thing Smith supporters find difficult to come to grips with. But Smith lays out the principles of taxation quite clearly, so it's not that he's for a zero-cost state. And I think that if you want markets to bear the burden of allocating resources, which is what essentially Adam Smith was arguing for, then you have to have the correct price signals coming so that the resources are properly allocated. And those price signals must include all of the costs of producing a good and service or consuming it, including the social costs that are not reflected in the posted price. That means government has a role to see to it that either by taxation or some other means, it incorporates these social costs. There is no argument in economics or equity that says I should be allowed to impose my costs on someone else. It won't fly. So that's 3.